He left a vault full of millions wide open to catch a thief. But the maid didn't steal a thing. She guarded it for 6 hours. What she did next changed his legacy, his life, and the lives of thousands. If this story touched your heart, please consider hitting that subscribe button. My channel is still small, so every single sub truly means the world to me. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for feeling this journey with me. The estate sat on a ridge just beyond the fog line, where the Blue Ridge Mountains met the still edges of Asheville's northern outskirts. It was neither palatial nor modest, but fortified. A modern redoubt wrapped in red brick tradition and laced with digital veins, 24 motion-triggered cameras, 3 layers of biometric access, fingerprint door locks, retina-scanning safes, and an AI-integrated alarm system that monitored everything from heat signatures to the pH of rainwater. But no security system, no matter how advanced, could guard against what Edward Langston feared most: people. At 78, Edward had seen everything he wished he hadn't: betrayal from blood, theft disguised as affection, loyalty measured in inheritance percentages. The once venerated shipyard magnate had built his wealth on contracts, steel hulls, and handshake deals that used to mean something. That world, like his late wife Elizabeth, had gone. What remained was a man suspended in polished silence and cold routines. He had fired the last gardener for asking too many questions, the housekeeper before that for humming too cheerfully, and the personal assistant, a Yale graduate with references, had been caught lifting vintage cufflinks from the guest bedroom drawers. Edward had stopped confronting them. He simply watched the footage, wrote checks, and replaced them like broken parts. But time, the most stubborn of masters, had begun to pull at his bones. His knees resisted stairs. His lungs hated winter. The simple act of polishing Elizabeth's antique writing desk left his fingers aching for hours. It wasn't pride that forced him to hire someone new. It was necessity. He called a placement firm in Atlanta, not the typical high-profile agency. This one specialized in discretion, quiet applicants with no digital trail and no taste for small talk. He requested 3 things: no criminal record, no social media, no interest in conversation. 3 candidates were offered. He dismissed the first 2 based on posture alone. The third, Camille Brooks, arrived on a Tuesday morning with a resume printed on recycled cardstock and a canvas tote bag slung over one shoulder. No perfume, no nail polish, no jewelry. Her dark brown skin was smooth, her expression composed, and her short hair was tied back in a practical twist with a cloth band. Edward observed her from the upstairs hallway before making his way down. She stood still on the porch, not fidgeting, not scrolling her phone. That in itself was unusual. "Come in," he said gruffly. She stepped inside and glanced briefly at the marble inlay beneath her feet. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Langston," she said without a smile, but with perfect clarity. He gestured toward the sitting room. "We'll keep this short." She sat straight, knees together, her tote placed gently beside her. She asked no questions about pay, no compliments on the house. Her first words were, "Would you prefer the library books dusted without shifting them, or may I align them by spine height?" Edward paused. That was not the question of someone angling for favor. "You may align them only if they're off-center," he said, testing her. She nodded. "Any chemical sensitivities I should know about? Pets? Specific fabrics?" "No," he replied. She made a small notation in a well-used notebook. The interview lasted 17 minutes. She told him she was working part-time while completing her master's in social work online. Her mother ran a small grocery store in the rural outskirts of Hickory. Her father, once a school bus driver, had passed 5 years ago. She lived with 3 roommates and sent money home monthly. There was no oversharing, no self-pity, No elaborate explanations for her choice to clean homes while pursuing a degree most people used as a springboard into nonprofit management or politics. When he told her she could start Wednesday, she didn't thank him. She simply asked, "Would you like me here by 8?" After she left, Edward didn't go back to his coffee. He went to the study, pulled out his old logbook and wrote, "Camille Brooks. Clean tone, no flattery. Eyes honest. Possible. Test required." By the next morning, the test was set. The room was called the Vault, though it wasn't a bank-style safe. It was a converted archival chamber behind a heavy walnut door, cooled to preserve documents and valuables. Inside were 4 leather satchels, each stacked with $100 bills, vintage jewelry, notarized deeds, and personal letters from Elizabeth that Edward hadn't reread in decades. There were items even his lawyer didn't know he still kept. He entered the vault at 7:40 a.m., disabled the alarm manually, and propped the door just barely ajar. A single brass sconce illuminated the contents like an exhibit. Then he retreated to his upstairs office, coffee in hand, and turned on Monitor 4. The front hallway came into view. The door to the vault waited, visible but not obvious. At exactly 8 o'clock a.m., Camille arrived. She wore the same simple black flats. No lipstick, no earrings. She greeted him with a polite, "Good morning, sir," and slipped off her coat, folding it precisely before hanging it. Edward gave her the usual instruction. "Start where you see fit. I have a call." Then he left the room, or rather, pretended to. On the screen, he watched her move with methodical focus. First, she dusted the foyer's baseboards, then the brass handles on the French doors. Her movements were fluid, almost meditative. No phone, no music. She didn't drift. She didn't glance down the hallway yet. Edward waited. After 30 minutes, she made her way toward the east corridor. Her footsteps slowed. There. The moment. She saw the door. She tilted her head, brows drawing ever so slightly. She approached, 2 steps, 3, then paused. Edward's breath hitched. Then Camille did something he did not expect. She knocked. Twice, firm, respectful. She waited. No answer. Then she took out her phone, not to record, not to text. She made a call. "Hi, this is Camille Brooks. I just started at Mr. Langston's residence. I think he might have left a room unsecured. It looks important. There's cash. Jewelry. Should I leave it alone or—" Edward smirked. He had briefed his estate attorney the day before to tell her to leave it untouched. She hung up, then stood, still, watching. 2 minutes passed, then 5. Edward leaned forward, studying her eyes through the grainy feed. Then, without fuss, Camille disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a wooden chair. She placed it in front of the door, and she sat. What happened next, Edward would recount years later as the moment that unraveled his armor. Camille Brooks, 27 years old, with student loans and a sick mother and no financial net, sat guard in front of an unlocked vault for 6 hours. At one point, she pulled a paperback novel from her tote. At another, she retrieved a wax-wrapped sandwich from her bag. She turned away delivery men, redirected a mail courier, and never let the vault out of sight. At 2:13 p.m., her phone rang again. She stepped aside to answer it. Edward couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but hers trembled. "No, Mama, I know. I know we need it by Friday. I'm trying. Yeah, 42. I don't know yet." She hung up. Her shoulders sagged. Her hand clutched the phone a second longer than necessary. Then, slowly, Camille rose from the chair, walked into the vault. Edward bolted upright. She didn't touch the money. She walked to the keypad, tried a code. It blinked red. So she slid the steel bolt across manually. Then, and this nearly made Edward weep, she picked up the small slip of paper with the correct code that he had left beside the door, and folded it, without reading it, and slipped it into her back pocket. She exited, closed the door behind her, and sat back down. Then, only then, did she cry. Silently. No sobs, no drama. Just her back hunched forward slightly, her palms clenched, and the tears sliding down her cheeks as if they'd been waiting months for a quiet place to fall. Edward Langston sat in his leather chair, utterly undone. No wealth could have bought that moment. No camera could fully capture what was blooming beneath the surveillance lens. It wasn't a test anymore. It was a revelation. And something in him, long calcified by betrayal and loss, cracked. Camille's legs ached, though she barely moved. The old chair from the breakfast nook had no cushion, and the wooden seat pressed hard against the backs of her thighs. But she didn't shift much. She didn't stretch or slouch. She sat facing the open vault like a sentinel, like someone who knew the weight of things, not just the weight of money, but of consequence. Time passed oddly in the Langston house. There were no clocks on the walls, no background noise, just the soft hum of hidden ventilation systems and the occasional groan of settling beams. The light from the hallway sconces bathed her in a quiet gold. She breathed in, out, again. Upstairs, Edward Langston watched. He had meant to observe her for 10 minutes at most. A curiosity, a test. But 2 hours had passed, and he hadn't moved. He hadn't sipped his coffee, hadn't opened his laptop. He simply stared at the girl who had, by every rational metric, failed to do the one thing most people in her situation would have done: take. At 3:17 p.m., Camille stood up for the second time that day. She walked down the hallway and returned a minute later with a feather duster. Then, without turning her back to the vault, she dusted the side table, the baseboards, and the top of the chair rail. It was both ordinary and extraordinary. Then her phone rang again. She turned slightly and stepped 3 feet from the vault, enough to maintain her watchful angle. Her voice dropped. The camera's mic caught only fragments. "Mama. No, I'm still here. Yes, I know. The bank called again? How long? Friday?" A pause. "I don't know, Mama. I'm doing the best I can. I'm trying." She hung up and pressed her hand to her face for a moment. But again, she didn't collapse. She didn't scream or crumble. She simply turned, walked calmly to the vault, and stepped inside. Slowly. Edward's heart clutched, but she didn't reach for the satchels. She didn't so much as brush against the antique brooches or stacks of bills. She moved directly to the wall where the keypad was mounted. She tried a code. 1, 2, 3, 4. Nothing. Red light. Then, she reached for the steel bolt and slid it across with a loud clunk. She looked at the slip of paper beside it, the one Edward had left with the actual code, stared for half a second, folded it carefully without reading it, and tucked it into her back pocket. Then she closed the door and sat again. This time, she wept. Not loud sobs, just the kind of weeping that folds inward, silent and private, the kind people do when there is no one left to impress and no one coming to help. Edward watched. and something in him, long dormant, stirred uncomfortably. It wasn't guilt. Not quite. It was shame. By 5:30 p.m., he made his choice. He cleared his throat loudly as he walked down the main staircase, keys jangling in his pocket, shoes deliberately heavy. He opened the front door, then closed it again, as if returning from an errand. He wanted her to believe the illusion, that he had been gone, that she hadn't been watched. He entered the hallway. Camille stood up instantly. Her eyes were red, but her expression was calm. She tucked a curl of hair behind her ear and stood with her hands clasped in front of her. "Mr. Langston," she said, her voice steady despite everything. "I hope you don't mind. I noticed the door to one of the rooms was open this morning. I thought it might have been a mistake." Edward didn't reply right away. He looked at her for a long moment. Not unkindly, not coldly, just searching. "I called your assistant," she added quickly. "She said not to touch anything, so I didn't. But I didn't want to leave it unattended." He nodded. "I saw." Camille blinked. "You saw?" He gestured upward. "There are cameras in every room. Even that one." Her face didn't change. Not shame, not anger, just a tiny flicker of recognition. "I understand," she said. "It's your house." There was a silence. A long one. Then Edward surprised himself. "You seemed upset earlier," he said, his tone softer than he'd intended. "Everything all right?" Camille hesitated. "I wasn't going to say anything. It's not your problem." "Perhaps not," Edward said. "But you've spent most of today guarding what isn't yours. That earns you at least one question." Her lips trembled slightly. She looked down. "My mom's store," she said. "It's small, family-run. She's had it 30 years. But a new chain opened nearby, one of those big-box discount places. We lost half our customers in a month." Edward said nothing. "The bank's threatening to close us down if we don't pay off the remaining debt. 42,000. I work 2 jobs. I'm in school full-time. I live with 3 roommates in an apartment that smells like old bleach. I send money home every month, but it's not enough." She paused, then forced a small exhale. "But none of that justifies taking what isn't mine." "No," Edward said quietly. "It doesn't." Another pause. Camille looked at him. "I didn't even think about it," she whispered. "Not because I'm a saint, because it wouldn't have been right, even if no one ever found out." Edward nodded slowly. "That's rarer than you think." She looked down again. The pain of her situation still sat in her shoulders, but her spine remained straight. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out an envelope. "I was going to give you this at the end of the week," he said, "but now seems more appropriate." Camille took the envelope with hesitation. She opened it. Inside was a stack of bills. $50,000. Her hands froze. "I can't take this," she said, nearly breathless. "You can," Edward said. "You earned it." "I didn't clean the bedrooms. I didn't finish the kitchen." "You passed the test." "Test?" she asked, eyebrows knitting. "I left the vault open on purpose," he admitted. "I do it with every new hire. Most people fail." Camille blinked. "You test people with millions of dollars?" "I test who they are when they think no one is watching." She didn't speak. "You didn't just pass," Edward said. "You stood guard." Still, she didn't move. "I'm not trying to buy you," he added. "I'm trying to thank you." She exhaled, her voice cracked. You already helped my family once. You didn't know it." Edward frowned. "What do you mean?" She reached into her tote bag and pulled out a folded clipping from 3 years ago, an article about anonymous donations to Mission Health. "My cousin Noah was born with a heart defect," she said. "We couldn't afford the surgery. The hospital said an anonymous donor covered the full amount. I saw your name on a donor registry months later. I connected the dots." Edward's eyes dropped to the faded newspaper. He remembered the donation. He hadn't expected anyone to trace it. "I didn't come here for money," she said. "I came because I wanted to thank you, to know what kind of person would do something like that." Now Edward truly had no words. Camille looked down at the envelope in her hands. "I still don't think I can take this." "You already did more than enough," he said, "and I think you're just getting started." Edward Langston stood in his study long after Camille had left for the evening. He hadn't turned off the monitors. The hallway where she had spent nearly the entire day sitting guard still glowed dimly on one of the central screens. He watched the faint reflection of her outline in the glossy wood of the vault door. Even in absence, her presence lingered. He hadn't felt this kind of uncertainty in years. Not the kind born of fear, but of reconsideration. The kind that forced you to look inward, and not like what you saw. Later that night, in the quiet of the house, he opened Elizabeth's writing desk for the first time in over a decade. The wood creaked gently, a familiar sound that reminded him of her perfume and the way her fingers used to tap the edge of the pages when she was deep in thought. He pulled out an old envelope, yellowed at the edges. Inside, folded in thirds, was a handwritten list titled Legacy Tests. It was Elizabeth's idea, a moral experiment they had once dreamed of conducting. Back when the Langston Trust was still new, and they'd hoped to find young people who could inherit not just wealth, but responsibility. He had forgotten that list. Camille Brooks, without knowing it, had passed every single item. The next morning, she arrived as always, early, quiet, prepared. Her eyes were tired but focused. She was wearing the same pair of black flats and the same gray cardigan she'd worn on day one. No pretense, no performance. Edward waited for her in the hallway, something he rarely did. She stopped mid-step. "Mr. Langston?" He nodded toward the parlor. "Let's sit." Camille hesitated. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," he said. "You did something right." They sat opposite each other in 2 deep leather chairs that had once hosted governors and foreign dignitaries. Now they cradled a man trying to understand trust again, and a woman who didn't know she had become the most significant person in his life in under 48 hours. "I owe you a proper explanation," Edward said. "About yesterday." "You don't have to," she said. "But I want to," he replied, and for once, he meant it. He explained the test, how every staff member in the past 5 years had been unknowingly tested. A watch left on the kitchen counter, a folder with blank checks left half-tucked from a drawer, a wine bottle replaced with a priceless vintage. "They all failed," he said flatly. "Some instantly, some later, but none passed." Camille listened, arms folded gently in her lap. "And you left the vault open, to see if I would do the same." Edward nodded. "And you didn't." She was quiet for a moment. "It still doesn't make sense," she said. "You didn't know me. I didn't even know you were watching." "That's the point," he said. She looked away. "So, I passed your test. What does that mean, really?" Edward leaned forward. "It means I don't want you to leave." Her eyes flicked to his, unsure. "I'd like to offer you a permanent position, more than cleaning. I'd like your help with something larger. Camille blinked. Larger? He stood slowly and walked to the mantelpiece. From behind a faded family photograph, he pulled out a thin file. He handed it to her. Inside was a copy of the original charter for the Langston Trust, the nonprofit foundation that Edward and Elizabeth had built quietly over decades. Camille scanned the pages. Her hands trembled slightly. I thought this was a private thing, she said. It was, until now. I'm not a philanthropist, she said softly. I'm a student. I mop floors. You're also the only person I've trusted in years, he said, and the only one who's never asked me for anything. Camille's brow furrowed. What are you asking me for now? Edward sat back down, his voice low. I want you to help me decide what comes next. I don't need a housekeeper. I need someone who sees the world the way you do. Someone who knows what it means to go without and what $100 can do for a struggling family. Someone who'll remember where the money came from and where it should go. Camille let out a slow breath. You're serious? Entirely. I don't have experience. I didn't either when I started, he said. She looked down at the file again. The Foundation's mission was written in clean serif font across the front. To repair what systems have broken through dignity, discretion, and meaningful care. Your wife wrote that? She asked. He smiled faintly. She lived it. A long pause. Finally, Camille asked, Why me? Edward didn't hesitate. Because you didn't take what wasn't yours. Because you guarded something no one asked you to. Because you reminded me what it looks like when someone shows up for the right reasons. Camille closed the file. Her voice was small. And if I say no? Then you'll still have a job, he said, and my respect. But if you say yes, we start rewriting what legacy looks like. She sat with that for a while. Then she nodded, slowly. I want to help, she whispered, but not for the money, not for a title, because I believe people deserve more than they're given. I always have. Edward smiled. Then we'll start with that. It was nearly dusk when Camille returned home that evening. The binder Edward had given her still clutched in both hands like a sacred text. Her apartment was quiet. Her roommates were at class or working late shifts. She placed the folder gently on the small kitchen table beside a bowl of half-eaten cereal and unopened mail, then stood there, motionless, watching it. For most of her adult life, Camille had walked through the world with invisible weights, the pressure to provide, to outperform, to survive. Now, for the first time, someone had offered her not just a lifeline, but a platform. Not charity. Trust. She didn't sleep much that night. When morning came, the sky outside was pale gray and spitting rain. Soft, hesitant. Camille put on her black flats again, the same ones she wore every day, and boarded the city bus headed back toward Langston Hill. She didn't know what she would say. She only knew something needed to be said. When she arrived at the estate, Edward was already waiting in the front parlor, as if expecting her hesitation. He stood by the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, not speaking until she had fully entered the room. You didn't sleep, he said, not as a question. No, she replied. Too much to process. Edward nodded. I brought something, she said, reaching into her canvas tote. She pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping, its corners soft and edges slightly torn. The ink was faded, but the headline still legible. Anonymous Donor Funds Life-Saving Pediatric Surgeries at Mission Health. Edward stiffened, though subtly. Camille placed the article on the coffee table between them. My cousin Noah, she said, was one of the children mentioned. He was 8 at the time. born with a congenital heart defect. Edward didn't speak. We didn't have insurance that covered the operation. My uncle tried to apply for a loan, begged for aid. They said the waiting list was too long and we needed $87,000 up front. She paused. Then one day the hospital called, said someone had paid in full, no name, just a confirmation. We never knew who it was. She looked up, directly into Edward's eyes. Until a few months later, I saw your name in a quiet donor list. You weren't on the press release. You weren't at the ribbon cutting, but I recognized it. Edward's lips parted slightly, but no words came. I didn't apply for the job here just because it paid well. I asked the agency to find me work in this neighborhood. I knew I couldn't thank you through a letter. You'd ignore it. So I came to see who you were. The room fell into heavy stillness. The fireplace clicked quietly as its embers settled. Edward finally sat, slowly. I had no idea, he said. Camille nodded. I figured. I didn't do it for thanks. I know. I never wanted recognition. I'm not giving you any, she said gently. I just wanted you to know what that meant. What you did. Edward swallowed. Is he all right? He's in 9th grade, she said. Wants to be a cardiologist. A quiet laugh escaped Edward's throat. It was hoarse, surprised, like a hinge that hadn't moved in years. That's the first time anyone's told me something like that, he said. In person. You've helped people anonymously for years, Camille said. But I don't think anyone ever helped you realize why it mattered. Edward leaned back in the chair, the old leather groaning beneath his weight. He closed his eyes for a long moment, letting the truth settle. I thought anonymity was dignity, he said. Now I think it was just fear. A way to give without opening the door. Camille tilted her head. You can do both. You did. I didn't let anyone stay long enough to say so, he replied. Until you. There was a pause. May I ask something? She said. Edward gestured for her to continue. The vault. Why that room? Why use that as a test? Edward looked toward the hallway, though the vault was 2 floors away. Because that room holds the last pieces of my life before everything fell apart, he said quietly. My wife's letters. The deed to the first shipyard. The brooch she wore the night we danced under the oak trees. He paused. I lost her to ovarian cancer 12 years ago. She passed in that house. Camille's voice softened. I'm sorry. She was the one who believed people could be good, Edward continued. I stopped believing the day her nurse stole her wedding ring. Camille flinched. I wanted to believe again, he said, but I didn't know how. She nodded. So you opened the door, but only halfway. Edward smiled faintly. You're the first person who didn't walk through it, and still proved you belonged inside. They sat for a while in silence, not heavy, but companionable. The kind of quiet between 2 people who know they are rebuilding something fragile together. Finally, Camille broke it. I still don't know why you think I'm the one to help you lead this foundation. Edward leaned forward, rested his elbows on his knees. Because you understand something most people forget. What's that? That decency isn't just an instinct, it's a discipline, and you've practiced it every day of your life. Camille looked down, then back at him. I never saw it that way. I have, he said, and I've been watching the world for a very long time. She gave him a small smile. Edward reached for the folder again. So, shall we begin? Camille nodded. Let's. The study smelled of cedar, old paper, and something faintly floral, as if Elizabeth Langston's presence still lingered in the corners of the room. Camille stood by the threshold, unsure whether to enter until Edward gestured her forward. She had been in many rooms of the house by now, but never this one. It was unlike the others. Where the hallway shimmered with pristine finishes and technological sleekness, this room was warm, personal. The walls were lined with books not alphabetized but lived in, dog-eared, spine-cracked, not for display. A framed photograph sat near the window, a younger Edward and Elizabeth, standing under a grove of cherry blossoms, their smiles unguarded, effortless. Edward moved to a black walnut desk and opened a drawer with a key. From inside, he pulled out a leather portfolio, thick, old, heavy with use. He placed it between them on the small conference table and untied the worn ribbon that held it closed. "This," he said quietly, "is the Langston Trust." Camille pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. "I thought it was just a name." Edward shook his head. It was everything to her. He flipped through the contents: foundation charters, funding breakdowns, handwritten notes in Elizabeth's cursive. Interspersed were photos: a mobile dental clinic in Macon, a women's shelter in Chattanooga, a scholarship recipient shaking hands with a principal under a balloon arch. Elizabeth didn't believe in charity, Edward said. She believed in repair. She used to say, "We can't save people, but we can build scaffolding strong enough for them to climb." Camille's gaze fell on a page titled Selection Protocol, Discretion, Dignity, Impact. "She wrote this?" Camille asked. "Every word," Edward replied. "She managed the giving. I just signed the checks." "Until she passed." Edward nodded once. "After that, I kept the trust running, but I stopped believing in the people we were helping. Too many stories, too many disappointments. So I shifted it to anonymous giving. Safe. Distant." Camille didn't answer right away. "I've read enough social ethics to know there's value in anonymous giving," she finally said. "There is," he agreed. "But there's also cowardice. I didn't want to see the outcomes anymore, good or bad." She looked at the folder. "And now?" Edward exhaled through his nose, a long, tired breath. "Now I want someone to hold this with me. Someone who doesn't see the world through spreadsheets but through need." "You think that's me?" "I know that's you." Camille opened the portfolio gently. Near the back was a current ledger: disbursements, residual balances, property holdings. The numbers made her head spin. "This is a lot," she said. Edward sat down across from her. "I'm not asking you to run it alone. I'm asking you to help me reimagine it." Her hands rested on the folder's cover. "I don't have a degree in finance." "But you know how much a single bus pass matters when the car breaks down," he replied. "You know what a 3-day rent extension feels like to a single mother with an eviction notice taped to her door." Camille's eyes welled, but she blinked it back. "You don't think I'm too young?" "I think you're the right kind of young. You haven't learned cynicism yet." She laughed softly, more a breath than a sound. "Give it time." Edward's smile returned, real this time. "I'd rather give you this." He reached beneath the desk and withdrew a second envelope, sealed. "What is it?" Camille asked. "A stipend," he said. "For your time, starting today. You'll remain on payroll as staff, but with a new title, Special Advisor for Community Strategy." She raised an eyebrow. "Is that a real title?" "I made it up this morning." She took the envelope but didn't open it. "I'm not doing this for money." "I know," he said. "That's why I trust you with it." Camille sat back in the chair. The silence between them felt full, not awkward, but reverent. "You said something yesterday," she murmured, "about how I reminded you of someone." Edward looked toward the window. Outside, the dogwoods were beginning to bloom. "Elizabeth," he said, "you don't look like her, but you do the things she used to do. You make people remember what they once believed in." Camille looked down. She didn't speak, but her hand rested gently on the edge of the portfolio. They spent the rest of the morning in quiet collaboration. Camille reviewed past grant programs, asking thoughtful questions. Edward explained how Elizabeth used to vet each application, not just through numbers, but through letters, stories, patterns. They made lists. What worked? What failed? What needed revival? By noon, a legal pad sat between them with pages of scribbled notes and ideas. Community grocery fund, transportation stipends for rural students, emergency housing reserves, health care microgrants. "Your handwriting is terrible," Camille teased, tapping his column of notes. "I'm old," he said. "You're also the only man I've met who knows how to use a paper ledger." Edward grinned. "Because paper doesn't crash." That afternoon, they stood in front of a wall-mounted map of the Southeast. Camille began pinning small red flags into cities, towns she had visited on volunteer trips, places where her professors had contacts, counties she knew had high eviction rates. Edward watched her move, confident, precise. "You're not just here to help," he said. "You're here to lead." Camille stopped, her fingers still on the map. "I'm not sure I know how to do that yet." "You will." She turned to face him. "And if I fail?" "Then you fail," he said. "And we learn." Camille exhaled. "That's terrifying. That's how you know it's real." She smiled. It wasn't radiant or triumphant. It was quiet, earned. The kind of smile that came not from success, but from being seen. It began with a single sticky note on the refrigerator. "Hope Accord. Ask Edward if he means the legal kind or the poetic kind." Camille had scribbled it at midnight, after reading through the foundational documents of the Langston Trust for the 4th time. There, hidden between pages of grant reports and strategy memos, she'd found a draft proposal titled The Hope Accord. It was never submitted, never finalized. Just an idea. Or perhaps a dream. By sunrise, she brought it to Edward over coffee. "You wrote this?" she asked, sliding the faded document across the table. Edward looked down, then slowly nodded. "Elizabeth did. I only renamed it after she passed." "What is it?" He tapped the first line, "A network of those who have been helped, given the tools to help others." "She always believed that generosity without continuity was just performance," he said. "She wanted to build a bridge, not just from rich to poor, but from survivor to servant." Camille read the opening sentence again. "Hope doesn't trickle. It echoes." "I want to build it," she said. Edward didn't blink. "Then let's begin." They moved fast. Within 2 weeks, Camille had secured a tiny office in downtown Asheville. A second-story walk-up above an old record store that smelled of vinyl and history. The walls were cracked, the carpet worn thin, but there was light from every window, and space for dreams to stretch. With Edward's blessing, she hired 2 part-time staff members, Jordan, a soft-spoken social work graduate who had once been a foster youth, and Lena, a retired school teacher from West Asheville whose pension barely paid for groceries. Neither had ever been in a leadership role before. Both were precisely the kind of people the Hope Accord was built for. They didn't wear suits, they wore sneakers and purpose. The first three initiatives were modest but targeted. 1. The grocery circle, prepaid debit cards distributed discreetly through school nurses and social workers. 2. The transit link, free monthly passes for low-income workers living in rural areas with limited access to employment hubs. 3. The repair fund, emergency stipends, max $800 for critical life disruptions, broken glasses, sudden childcare needs, flat tires before job interviews. Each program required 3 things from participants: a 5-minute intake conversation, a signed agreement to pass it forward when possible. 1 story shared, not for publication but for understanding. Camille insisted on this third piece. "Data tells us what's broken," she said to her staff, "but stories tell us where to begin." As the weeks passed, Camille began to shed the instinct to doubt herself. She stopped flinching before speaking in meetings. She replaced her inner monologue, "What if I mess this up?" with a steadier one, "What needs fixing first?" Edward visited weekly but never intervened. He sat in the back of the office like an observer at a gallery. Once he brought an old brass lamp from Elizabeth's desk and placed it quietly on Camille's. "She'd want it here," he said. Then came the city council presentation. Word of the Hope Accord had reached the ears of a progressive councilwoman who invited Camille to speak at the monthly meeting, not just to showcase her work, but to explain her philosophy. Camille was terrified. Edward drove her to City Hall, even though she offered to take the bus. On the ride over, she held a flash drive in one hand and a note card in the other. Her palms were damp. "You'll be fine," he said gently. "I'm a janitor's daughter with no political background and a degree I haven't finished yet." "You're a builder," he said, "and you have a blueprint no one else does." The council chamber was modest. Wood-paneled walls, rows of folding chairs, a dais with microphones. Camille stepped up to the podium under harsh fluorescent lights, aware of every breath, every eye. She didn't use her slides. She told them about her mother's store and how it closed when the bank called in the loan early. She told them about a bus pass that could have made the difference between a missed interview and a hired job. She told them about the woman who walked 5 miles with her daughter in the rain just to make it to a free clinic. And then she said, "We talk a lot about equity. We write reports, we allocate funds, but we rarely ask ourselves, does this kindness last? The Hope Accord isn't charity, it's continuity. It's building systems that remember people, not just fix them. Because the future doesn't begin with legislation, it begins with someone having a reason to show up. One more day." When she finished, the room was silent. Then came the applause. Not polite, real. 2 weeks later, the Hope Accord received its first city grant. Edward poured the champagne himself. "I haven't poured drinks since the Eisenhower administration," he joked. They toasted in paper cups under the flickering fluorescent light of their office. Camille raised her cup. "To Elizabeth," Edward touched his to hers, "and to you." That night, Camille stayed late, long after the others had gone. She stood in the office alone, staring at the whiteboard covered in ideas, failures, and a few scribbled successes. There was a peace in the room, not unlike the one she felt years ago when she first sat at her mother's cash register, believing she could fix everything with hard work and honesty. Her phone buzzed, a message from her mother. "Saw you on the local news." I cried. "Your grandma would have called you a storm wrapped in grace." Camille smiled. And in that moment, she no longer felt like the girl who had once stood outside a locked vault. She was the architect of doors now, and the keeper of every key worth turning. The first sign of momentum wasn't the new office chairs or the emails piling up in Camille's inbox. It was the map. By mid-spring, the wall in the Asheville office that had once held only red pins now shimmered with multicolored tacks. Yellow for prospective cities, blue for active partnerships, green for graduates of the Hope Accord's new mentorship initiative. Camille stepped back one morning, coffee in hand, and smiled. Knoxville, Raleigh, Charleston, Greensboro, all cities that had once been names in textbooks or stops on long drives, now places with names and faces she could call. They weren't franchises, they weren't branches, they were people. Survivors turned strategists. She thought of Mariah, a single mom in Charleston who had once slept in her car and now ran a child care microfund. Of Jaden, a former juvenile detainee who was mentoring youth in Raleigh. Of Nia, who had used her Hope Accord transit pass to get to community college and was now opening a scholarship fund for teen parents. They didn't wear matching lanyards, they didn't report in with quarterly reviews, but they sent postcards, voice notes, monthly updates written like journal entries. Camille called it the trust tree. But not everyone welcomed growth with open arms. As word spread and media attention intensified, so did scrutiny. Local journalists began asking questions. Who is this 27-year-old running a multi-million-dollar impact network? Where's the oversight? Is she even qualified? Camille's name, once misspelled in every grant proposal, now ran across headlines. From Maid to Movement, the story behind the Hope Accord. Too fast, too good, Asheville's quiet philanthropy faces big questions. One evening, Edward placed a folded newspaper on her desk. She braced herself. "Page 5, he said. She flipped through. It was a profile, measured, not unkind. But the subtext was clear. Can this last? Camille looked up. Are we in trouble? Edward sat down across from her. We're in the open. That's not the same. I didn't sign up to be famous. You didn't, but you signed up to be effective. And sometimes those intersect. The boardroom meeting was called unexpectedly. 3 of the Langston Trust's legal advisors, all men older than Edward, flew in from Atlanta, their suits crisp and expressions sharper. Camille wore her best blouse, which was still one of 3 she owned from a Goodwill rack. She tied her hair back and tucked her trembling hands under the table. What is the sustainability model? One of the advisors asked. And the liability strategy? Said another. What if someone misuses the grocery fund and gets hurt? Or misrepresents their story? Camille answered every question. Not perfectly, not with every statistic on hand, but with clarity. She spoke of the safeguards, the check-ins, the real-time evaluation systems. She used words like impact audit and fiduciary review, terms she had only learned 4 months ago, but now owned like armor. At one point, one advisor leaned forward. You don't have a master's. You barely have a bachelor's. This kind of expansion, it needs someone with a longer resume. Camille didn't flinch. With respect, she said, no resume in this room includes what it's like to choose between gas and diapers. Edward smirked behind his coffee. The room went quiet. Then, one of the lawyers, the quietest among them, cleared his throat. I've reviewed the disbursement reports, he said. 0 misuse, 0 fraud, record engagement. You're doing something right. Camille nodded once. The meeting ended with handshakes, uneven ones, but handshakes nonetheless. That weekend, Camille and her staff returned to their roots. They hosted a backyard potluck in West Asheville. No name tags, no agenda. Just food, music, and laughter. Edward sat in a lawn chair, a dog asleep at his feet, watching a new generation of bridge builders dance barefoot under string lights. He turned to Camille. You know what you've done? She smiled. Tried not to fall on my face? You've created a currency stronger than dollars. She raised an eyebrow. Hope? No, he said. Reputation. And it buys you something money never will. Which is time, grace, and the benefit of the doubt, when you'll need it most. Later that night, as Camille helped Lena wash dishes in the kitchen, Jordan peeked in with his phone held high. You're on TV. Camille froze. It was a short segment, just her voice, layered over footage of the Hope Accord team handing out resource cards at a local library. The anchor called her a rising face of localized philanthropy. Camille exhaled. I thought they were going to eat me alive. They still might, Lena teased, drying a plate. But they'll have to wait till dessert. Before bed, Camille walked alone through the empty streets of her neighborhood. She passed the mural on Haywood Avenue that had once been tagged with graffiti, now painted over with a quote from Elizabeth Langston herself. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's who walks forward because of you. Camille placed her hand over the words. The streetlight flickered once, then steadied, and she walked on. Edward Langston had never been a sentimental man. He knew how to measure a hull by the sound of a hammer, how to calculate leverage before instinct, and how to read a man's character by the way he greeted the janitor. But love? That was something he had learned late. Too late, perhaps, to share it with his own children, who had long since retreated into their gated lives of luxury and quiet resentment. But not with Camille. Not with this girl who had once guarded a vault with her body, not for treasure, but for trust. It was a rainy Thursday when Edward asked her to lunch. Not the usual coffee in the corner office, not a debrief over budget reports. He wore a blazer he hadn't touched in years and asked her to meet him at a small Italian place tucked between a bookstore and a florist on Lexington Avenue. Camille arrived in jeans and a blazer too big at the shoulders. She looked nervous, even though she'd just spoken to city councils and national donors the week before. You look like you're meeting your parole officer, he teased as she sat. I thought maybe you were going to fire me. Edward raised an eyebrow. From a position I never technically hired you for. She laughed softly. Touché. They ordered pasta. Camille chose penne arrabbiata. Spicy, fiery. Edward ordered something simpler. Their server was new, fumbling with the order pad, but Camille smiled and thanked her like she was family. Edward saw it again. That instinct not just to lead, but to dignify. You remind me of someone, he said suddenly. Camille looked up. Elizabeth? He shook his head. No, me, before I learned how to hide. When the plates were cleared, Edward pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. I've had our attorneys draft this, he said. Camille took the paper. At the top, Amendment to Langston Trust, Leadership and Succession. Her name was there, not as staff, not as recipient, but as co-executive director of the Hope Accord and successor steward of the Langston Trust legacy. Her hands trembled. I don't understand, she whispered. I've built many ships, Camille, but this one is the only one that feels unsinkable, because you're in it. She blinked hard, suddenly 6 years old again, standing beside her mother's register, pretending the coins in her pocket were enough to keep the world spinning. But I'm not your daughter. Edward smiled, his voice low. I know that, but I've had children who share my name and none of them ever earned what you've built, what you've protected, what you've become. Camille stared at the page, her name printed beside his. I don't know if I'm ready. Edward leaned closer. None of us are. But sometimes we say yes anyway, because someone needs to. That evening, they returned to the office together. Lena and Jordan were working late sorting through community grant applications. When they saw Edward and Camille walk in together, holding copies of the signed amendment, they burst into spontaneous applause. Jordan joked, "Guess I should start calling you boss lady full-time now?" Camille laughed, but her eyes shone. "I'd rather you just keep calling me Camille." That night, Edward did something he hadn't done in decades. He called each of his 3 children, left the same voicemail. "I've named someone else as steward of the trust. Her name is Camille Brooks. If that offends you, know that this is not about legacy by blood. It's about who shows up and who never leaves." None of them called back. But Edward didn't expect them to. The family he'd once built with inheritance had crumbled under its own entitlement. But this one, built on loyalty, vigilance, and choice, stood. A week later, they held a small press conference in front of the Asheville office. No stage, no banners, just a microphone and 2 people who didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. Camille stood beside Edward as he introduced her to the world, not as an assistant, not as an executive director, but as the future of every value I ever held sacred. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't use notes. "I never thought I'd be trusted with anything bigger than a mop," she began, laughter rippling through the crowd. "But trust has a strange way of choosing us, not because we've earned it, but because someone believed we could grow into it." She paused, looking over at Edward. "I used to think family was something you were born into, but I've learned it can also be something you build, slowly, brick by brick, with truth and with choice." That night, as the lights dimmed in the Hope Accord office, Camille unlocked a drawer she'd never dared open before. Inside was a single item, a brass compass engraved with the initials E.L. There was a note beneath it, handwritten in Edward's neat block letters. "A compass doesn't tell you what to choose. It only reminds you there is a direction, and someone, somewhere, will always be following your lead." She clutched it gently, not because she needed a compass, but because for the first time she knew where she was going, and more importantly, who she was going with. The morning was cool and quiet when Edward called Camille into the study. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, slicing across the hardwood floor in golden ribbons. On his desk sat a leather-bound folio, aged, cracked at the corners, tied with a thin red cord. It was old, older than the house, perhaps even older than the trust itself. Camille stepped in with cautious curiosity. Edward was rarely this formal with her anymore. Gone were the stiff briefings and cautious distance. Now they shared quiet coffee, side comments, even the occasional crossword puzzle on the veranda. But this felt different. "Sit down," he said gently. "We have a few final ghosts to speak of." She obeyed, folding her hands in her lap. Edward opened the folio slowly, as though unraveling something sacred. "I want to tell you something I've never told anyone. Not my children, not my board, not even Elizabeth." Camille leaned forward. "The day you first came into this house," Edward said, "I already knew who you were." She blinked. "Knew me?" He nodded. "Before I hired you, I had you investigated." The words landed like cold wind. "I needed to know if you were real, if your story checked out. I didn't trust the world anymore, Camille, and I especially didn't trust myself." Camille was silent. Not shocked. She had suspected as much, but still, the truth hit with weight. I know it was wrong, Edward continued, eyes lowered. I crossed a line. And yet I did it because something about you scared me. Not in a dangerous way, but in a way that threatened to undo my defenses. Camille nodded slowly. What did you find? Edward looked up. I found a girl who didn't bend. Not when she was evicted. Not when her mother got sick. Not when she cleaned 12 hours a day and still made it to her evening classes. He pushed the folio toward her. Inside were documents. Not legal forms this time, but sketches, hand-drawn plans in faded pencil. Community centers shaped like spirals, not rectangles. Classrooms with round windows and gardens in the middle. Notes scribbled in the margins. Restore before instructing. Dignity equals first building block. No locks unless asked for. Camille's breath caught in her throat. What? What is this? Edward's voice softened. Elizabeth drew them, 15 years ago. She was planning a vision of restorative campuses long before Hope Accord ever had a name. He pointed to the largest sketch. A building shaped like an open hand. She called it the Garden of Second Chances. She never showed it to anyone. Said the world wasn't ready. Camille's eyes burned. Why are you showing me now? Because you are ready. He reached under the desk and pulled out a small black box. Inside was a single brass key. It was never about who would take the key, Edward said. It was always about who would never need to. Camille stared at the object, symbolic, heavy, unnecessary. You never needed permission to do what's right. You just did it. That's why the key is yours. Tears traced down her cheeks. I don't know what to say. You already said it, Edward whispered. Every time you chose duty over ego, every time you chose people over credit, you've been unlocking doors long before I ever offered you one. She closed the box and placed her hand on the drawings. I'll build this, Edward. I swear it. He smiled. I know you will. And not with my name. With your name and hers. That night, Camille returned to her apartment and spread the sketches across her kitchen table. Lena joined her, mug in hand, reading over the notes with wonder. Did you know Elizabeth wanted to do all this? Lena asked. No, Camille whispered. But I think maybe she was waiting for the right hands. They spent hours translating the designs into digital formats, labeling files, saving scans. Camille titled the folder, Langston Garden Initiative, Draft 0.0. She stared at the screen. It felt like a beginning, not a continuation. Elsewhere, Edward opened a locked drawer in his private study, the one nobody had touched in decades. Inside was a photograph. Elizabeth, holding a baby boy who would grow into a stranger. And beside it, a new photograph. Taken weeks earlier at the Hope Accord potluck. Camille mid-laugh, flower on her cheek, surrounded by people eating with their hands and hearts full. He placed the photo beside Elizabeth's. Then, for the first time in 20 years, he whispered aloud, She found it, Liz. The door you left open. Then he closed the drawer, locked it, and placed the key in a drawer that no one would ever need to open again. 1 year later, the map looked nothing like it once had. Where there had been a single office in downtown Asheville, there were now 12 dots across the country. Los Angeles, Chicago, Atlanta, Austin, Portland, Baltimore, and more. Each one a living, breathing branch of the Hope Accord. More than a network. More than a foundation. A pulse. Each center operated with its own flavor. its own heartbeat. In Portland, they ran a cafe run entirely by formerly incarcerated women learning to reintegrate. In Atlanta, it was a mobile clinic that parked outside low-income schools and offered free checkups, flu shots, and therapy sessions. In Chicago, a community-run library that never closed, staffed by retirees who still had stories to give. And at the center of it all was Camille Brooks. She no longer wore the second-hand blazers. Her shoes no longer clicked with hesitation. She moved with purpose now. Not because she believed she was infallible, but because she finally believed in what she carried. The Asheville office had changed, too. The front doors now bore a plaque in brushed brass, simple and bold. The Langston Hope Accord, built not on wealth, but on watchfulness. Inside, the same long table where Camille used to scrub coffee rings now hosted strategy meetings, donor briefings, and children's art workshops on Saturdays. It was a living space now, one that breathed like a lung, exhaled warmth, and welcomed anyone who entered with a whisper. You belong. Edward Langston passed quietly on a Sunday morning. There was no hospital room, no oxygen monitor, just soft jazz playing from the record player Elizabeth once adored, and the scent of lemon balm drifting through the open windows. Lena found him still holding a folder. Inside were the final approvals for the Los Angeles branch and a letter addressed to Camille in his own trembling script. Camille, if you're reading this, I have only one regret. That I didn't open the vault of my heart sooner. You showed me how, by guarding not what I had, but who I was. This world needs your fire, but even more than that, it needs your watchfulness. The quiet kind that listens first, the kind that builds not from a blueprint, but from breath. I trust you, I love you, and I see you. Edward. The memorial was small. That was Edward's wish. No suits, no podiums. Just the people whose lives he had touched, knowingly or not, gathering on the lawn of the original Hope Accord office. A musician played acoustic blues in the corner. Camille stood before the crowd, her hands folded, her breath steady. She spoke without notes. Edward Langston didn't leave a legacy, she said. He lived it. He breathed it. In the ways he learned to see again, to trust again, to love without requirement. She paused, scanning the faces. Lena wiping away tears, Jordan holding his son, one of the retired librarians from Chicago beaming in her floral dress. I once stood outside a door in his house, Camille continued, and chose not to enter. I thought I was protecting what was behind it, but now I know. The real vault wasn't made of steel. It was his heart, and once it opened, it never closed again. There was silence, not out of sorrow, but reverence. A week later, Camille stood before the Langston board to formally take her place as executive director. There were no objections, not even from the old donors who once called her the intern with big ideas. Her first action? To unveil the Elizabeth Langston Initiative, the blueprint born from Elizabeth's forgotten drawings. The first campus would be built on a donated plot of land just outside Asheville. A school, garden, medical clinic, and studio space, all built in a spiral, with no locked doors. It would open the following spring. The inscription over the front gate would read, "This is a place for second beginnings, for breath, for voice, for return." Months passed. On a rainy Tuesday, Camille returned to Edward's study. The house was now part of the trust, but she still came by once a week, to read, to remember, to feel the quiet. She opened the same drawer Edward once had. The photographs were still there. Elizabeth, Edward, and now, a third, a group photo from a retreat in Sedona, Camille in the middle, surrounded by 40 community leaders from across the country. She added a new one, a small boy holding a cardboard sign that read, "Thank you for giving my mom a job." She smiled, closed the drawer, then walked out the front door. Not as a guest, not as an heir, but as the woman who turned a single open door into a dozen others, and knew there were still hundreds more to build. And if this story moved you, even just a little, please consider subscribing. This channel is small, but with your support, it can carry more light into the world. One simple click means more than you know. Thank you.